Can the Brooklyn Nets still win the NBA championship even without James Harden? Let's get into this. When Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant teamed up and joined the Brooklyn Nets back in the offseason, the Brooklyn Nets instantly became title contenders. But during this season, when James Harden became unhappy with his Houston Rockets situation, he eventually wanted and demanded a trade to the Brooklyn Nets, and ever since he got traded to the Nets have become such heavy favorites to win the championship this season, it's become unfair at this point. Because even before the Nets got Harden, there was a lot of people thinking the Nets were favorites to win the championship with just Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant because they had really nice pieces around them. But now on top of that, they bring in a third absolute superstar with James Harden. Now it's just unfair. James Harden throughout his whole NBA career was known for a guy who was super durable and would play in every single game. But this season with the Brooklyn Nets, he's been dealing with a hamstring issue, and typically with hamstring issues, they tend to reoccur and really bother you for the whole season. And we've been seeing that with Harden. He was out already a pretty long time with the hamstring strain, and now again, just in the NBA playoffs just recently, he's had another flare-up with his hamstring injury, and he's going to be held out for another few games now. But now the real question is, if for whatever reason James Harden ends up being out for longer than we expect, could the Brooklyn Nets still get out of the East, and could the Brooklyn Nets still win an NBA championship like we all believed when they did have James Harden? Because before the Nets got Harden and had to trade all those pieces up for him, the big draw to the Brooklyn Nets was the fact that they have Kevin Durant, obviously Kyrie Irving, two superstars, but also on top of that they had Jared Allen, who's a great paint defender, and they had Karis LeVert, who was another great scorer off the bench. They just had so much great depth to them, but now they traded a lot of those pieces in order to get Harden. So the real question is, if for whatever reason they don't have Harden in this playoffs, could they still win? Because now they just have Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant and some other nice pieces, but they don't have that same depth that they did have before they traded for Harden. So first, before we move up and jump ahead to the NBA Finals and if they could win that, let's first talk about the playoff matchups they have in the Eastern Conference. So the Nets are currently up 2-0 on the Bucks, and they're looking very good in this series, even though they didn't have James Harden for most of it. And I feel like it's a pretty safe bet to say the Nets are going to win this playoff series. Of course, anything can happen. The Bucks are definitely a very talented team and a really good team, and a team that a lot of people thought would give a lot of problems to this Nets team. And when they come back home to Milwaukee, maybe they can wake up. Giannis could play better. Chris Middleton especially needs to play better. He could play better. Usually your role players play better at home as opposed to on the road, and maybe they can make a little run and maybe win back-to-back games at home, and now it's 2-0 and now it's a series again. But at this point, just based on how dominant the Nets have been against the Bucks, I think it's a pretty safe bet to say the Nets are going to win this series. And the fact that a lot of people thought this would be the biggest test in the Eastern Conference to the Nets, and the Nets didn't even have James Harden for this series and they're dominating thus far, I think it's a very good sign for them going forward. So let's assume for the sake of the video that the Nets do end up beating the Bucks, which I think they will. Now they're probably going to end up playing, in my opinion, they're going to be playing the Sixers, but maybe they'll play the Hawks. We'll see. Maybe they can pull it out. But I personally think they're going to play the Sixers. So how do the Nets match up against the Sixers? So obviously the Sixers have an amazing defense, and probably they're the best chance to beat the Nets, in my opinion, coming out of the Eastern Conference rather than the Milwaukee Bucks. And the reason why I think so is just due to the fact that the Sixers are so good on the defensive end. They might even be the best defensive team we have in the NBA. When you talk about Ben Simmons being able to guard 1 through 5, you talk about Joel Embiid, if he's healthy, probably the defensive player of the year, or really should be. Either him or Ben Simmons should be the defensive player of the year, probably. And then you talk about the other guys on their team that they have, Matisse Thybulle, who's an extremely good young defender. Danny Green is also a very good defender, a little underrated on the defensive end in my opinion. They just have defenders everywhere you look, and due to that fact, I think that's the best chance against the Nets, because they have the best chance to slow down their two stars in Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant if Harden is out. And on top of that, on the offensive end, of course the Sixers are great as an offensive team. When you talk about Tobias Harris, he's one of their best scorers on their team, and he's their go-to guy when they're struggling on the offensive end, as well as they have Joel Embiid to post up in the paint and just get buckets no matter what. He could hit threes, hit mid-range shots. He's just, everybody knows Embiid's almost impossible to stop. He is impossible to stop. Then you talk about Ben Simmons, who's just a great passer, and I think really gels everyone together and is really the glue guy that can pass to wide open teammates, has great vision, creates open shots for his teammates, and most of all, he gets to the basket very efficiently and effectively, dunking over people and finishing around the rim very effectively as well. So him and Embiid in the pick and roll is obviously very lethal when you talk about those two guys and what they can each do. The Sixers are definitely a very well-balanced team and a real true contender to win an NBA championship this season. But even though all those things that I mentioned and how good the Sixers are, even without James Harden, I still think I would lean towards the Brooklyn Nets to win that series. Just because offensively, they've been showing they're so good, and a big criticism of the Nets thus far has been their defensive ability. But in this playoff series so far, they've shown the ability to defend consistently, which is something they weren't doing in the regular season. So if they're able to defend consistently on top of their offensive talent and their offensive unselfishness with Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, and all the other guys they have as well, Joe Harris is a great shooter for them as well. The way they've been playing in the offensive end and defensive end, just in my opinion, makes it impossible for any team to really beat this team 4 times in a row, or 4 times in a series. So I think this series would be a lot closer than this Milwaukee Bucks series is thus far. But overall, I definitely do think the Nets would win that series, and let's assume for the video that they do win that series and make it to the finals. So I could see any one of the 4 teams in the West actually make the finals, but if I had to narrow it down, I would probably narrow it down to either the Phoenix Suns or the Los Angeles Clippers, as surprising as that may sound for the Clippers. I know a lot of people think the Jazz are going to win the series, but I really do like the Clippers, and I think they have a really good shot to pull it out. But let's just match up both of these teams to the Nets and see if either one of them really has a true shot to win this championship. So first, starting with the Phoenix Suns, they've definitely done a great job at improving their roster, improving their play overall. We see Chris Paul added to this team made a huge difference for them. Devin Booker really took his game to the next level. DeAndre Ayton is playing extremely well and took his game to the next level as well. Their role players all stepped up their game, and they're all playing extremely well. On the offensive end, they're very prolific with Devin Booker as their main scorer and Chris Paul calming everyone down and really getting plays running and getting the ball to wide open guys for a 3, or Devin Booker in the right spot, or pick and roll with DeAndre Ayton, pick and pop even. They're just very efficient in the offensive end, and for the Nets, it's going to be very difficult for them to stop that. And also on the defensive end, they're a pretty good defensive team as well, so they could definitely slow down or try to slow down this Brooklyn Nets team at least to some extent. So I think this series would definitely be extremely close as well, but again, I don't think anyone could beat this Brooklyn Nets team if they're playing this effectively on the defensive end, as well as obviously they're great on the offensive end with Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving and all the shooters they have around them. I just think it's very hard for me to believe that anybody could beat this Brooklyn Nets team, even if they don't have James Harden. I think they're just that good. Would I be absolutely shocked if this Suns team beat this Nets team without James Harden, if the Nets didn't have James Harden? I definitely wouldn't be absolutely shocked. I could definitely see it happening, but I would definitely be leaning towards the Nets in that playoff series. But now let's talk about the Los Angeles Clippers. So of course they have Paul George and Kawhi Leonard to lead their group, as well as really good role players as well, like Luke Kennard, Zubats, Rajon Rondo was a huge piece for them to add. They have great pieces alongside their main 2 guys, so they're definitely a very two-way team as well. They're a great defensive team, probably the best defensive team, if not one of the best defensive teams in the league. As well as on the offensive end, you have Kawhi Leonard and Paul George and other shooters all around you, so you're obviously going to be a very prolific team on the offensive end. So for the Nets, I think this would probably be the toughest team for them to actually defend. When you talk about Kawhi Leonard and how impossible he is to stop on the offensive end, as well as Paul George if he actually gets it going, and also they have all shooters around them, so they're definitely very difficult to defend. And then on the other end, I think Kawhi Leonard, you put him on Kevin Durant and he can slow him down, at least the best job anyone could do in the league. And then you also put Paul George on Kyrie Irving and he can try to slow him down to some extent, and I think that would be a very good series. And once again, in this series, I could definitely see the Clippers taking this series in a very close one, but overall, if I had to pick, I would definitely be leaning towards the Brooklyn Nets. I just think they're too talented once again. So overall, to answer the question of the video, do I think the Nets could win the NBA championship this year even without Harden? I definitely do think they can, and I think they're talented enough on both ends to do so. But anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think the Nets could still win the championship without James Harden, or do you think the Nets do need James Harden in order to win the championship? Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy, please leave a like and subscribe and hit that post notification bell. It really helps me out a lot. Until the next time, peace out, guys.